There's an ancient military order recorded in texts that does not sound like the others. It isn't conquer the land. It isn't expel the inhabitants. It is something more specific, more surgical, completely eliminate certain clans identified by name, Rephites, Anakites, the descendants of Og. The language is not generic. Deuteronomy lists names, territories, and lineages. Joshua receives exact coordinates. Hebron, Debir, Anab, the hill country of Judah and Israel. If this were merely war rhetoric or national propaganda, why so much detail? Why name the clans? Why the insistence on the verb exterminate, when in other passages the language allows for coexistence or taxation? And why, centuries later, does Goliath still appear coming from this exact lineage? Either the mission failed, or something more complex was happening. If you stay until the end, you will understand why this specific operation connects Genesis 6, Numbers 13, the kingdom of Og and Bashan, and a pattern of threat that the text treats as existential, not territorial, but genealogical. If this type of investigation interests you, where we try to separate what the text actually says from what we think it says, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This helps the algorithm find those who want to go deeper, without fantasy and without intellectual laziness. Today we are going to answer 3 direct questions. First, what the texts of Deuteronomy and Joshua actually command regarding these clans, word for word, without premature theological filters. Second, why these specific groups were treated differently from other Canaanite peoples, what the texts suggest as the reason, explicit or implicit. Third, what happened afterward, why Goliath appears, centuries later, coming from the same lineage that should have been eliminated, and what that implies about the execution of the mission or the nature of the problem. We will open 4 questions that will only be closed further ahead. Did Joshua fulfill the order? If so, where did Goliath come from? If not, why was the failure so specific? And is there any archaeological or textual evidence that explains why these clans, and not others, were the target? Deuteronomy 3 records the first elimination of a giant king, Og of Bashan. The text does not use vague language. It says 60 fortified cities, high walls, gates, bars, besides many unwalled towns. Og is described as the last of the Rephites. His bed, or sarcophagus, depending on the reading, measured 9 cubits long by 4 cubits wide. Using the standard cubit of approximately 45 centimeters, that is about 4 meters in length. If it is a funerary structure, it is monumental. If it is a literal bed, the person would need to have a proportional stature to justify the furniture. The text does not theorize about this. It merely records the measurement, the material, iron, and the location, Rabbah, of the Ammonites. The order given to Israel was clear: leave no survivor. Deuteronomy 3:3-6 repeats the formula: men, women, children. Everything was devoted to destruction. The Hebrew term is harem, complete ritual annihilation. This was not applied to all Canaanites. Other peoples were subjugated, taxed, or expelled, but not exterminated. Gibeonites deceived Israel and secured a treaty. Jebusites remained in Jerusalem for generations. But for the Rephites, the language is different. Why? The text does not offer an elaborate theological explanation at that moment. The reason appears in fragments. In Numbers 13, the spies describe the Anakites as Nephilim. They say, "We saw the Nephilim there." The descendants of Enoch come from the Nephilim. The connection is not metaphorical, it is genealogical. The spies do not say the Anakites were strong like Nephilim, they identify them directly. And Israel's reaction was panic, not tactical fear, but ontological terror. 40 years of delay. An entire generation lost in the desert because the majority refused to enter. Joshua and Caleb were the only ones who held their ground. We can overcome them. Now the obvious question, if they were just large and strong peoples, why was the reaction so disproportionate? Israel had just left Egypt with an organized army, with Moses, with documented theophanic manifestations. They were not cowards, but something about the Anakites generated a flight response. The text does not explain this directly, but it connects the Anakites to the Nephilim of Genesis 6. If this connection is taken seriously by the text, and it is textual, not interpretive, then Joshua's mission was not just to conquer territory. It was to eliminate a lineage. The language of harem was not applied to ordinary cities. It was applied to Jericho, Ai, Hazor, and specifically to the territories of the Rephites and Anakites. The question remains, why was this lineage considered an existential threat? Deuteronomy 2 provides a detail that many readers ignore. Before Israel, the Rephites occupied vast regions. They were expelled or destroyed by other peoples, Moabites, Ammonites, Philistines. The text calls the Rephites Amins in the land of Moab, Zamzumans in the land of Ammon. Different names, same lineage, and all were eliminated before Israel's arrival. This means Israel was not the only people to face and destroy these clans. Others did it before. Why? The text does not say explicitly, but the repetition of the pattern suggests something. These clans represented enough of a threat that multiple nations, at different times, adopted the same solution: total elimination. This proves nothing about their origin, but it indicates that the response pattern was consistent. If they were just large warriors, subjugation would be more efficient. Complete elimination suggests another kind of problem. Joshua receives the mission documented in Joshua 11:21-22. And at that time Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. This last detail is critical. The mission was fulfilled within Israelite territory, but some Anakites survived in 3 Philistine cities: Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Gath is the city where Goliath comes from centuries later. Goliath is explicitly identified in 2 Samuel 21 as a descendant of the Rephaites. He had 4 brothers, all giants, all from Gath. This means the lineage was not totally eliminated. It survived exactly where Joshua had no jurisdiction: Philistine territory. The question now changes its tone. Did Joshua fail? No. He fulfilled the order within the territory of Israel. But was the original order territorial or genealogical? If the problem was the lineage, and the text of Numbers 13 connects the Anakites to the Nephilim, then the survival of Gath was a strategic failure. If the problem was purely territorial, then Joshua fulfilled it perfectly. But then why is David, centuries later, still fighting giants of the same lineage? But first, Chronicles 20 lists 4 brothers of Goliath, all killed by David's warriors, all from Gath, all Rephaites. The text does not treat this as an anomaly. It treats it as continuity. The lineage continued. And it continued to be a specific threat, not a generic one. What makes this even more interesting is that the text does not romanticize the mission. It does not present Joshua as a tragic hero fighting supernatural forces. It presents a documented military operation with clear objectives and partial results. Hebron was taken. Debir was taken. Anab was cleared. But Gath remained out of reach. And from a narrative point of view, this creates a hook for the books of Samuel. The threat was not fully resolved. It reappears in David. And if you follow the chronology, Goliath is not presented as a surprise. He is presented as what was left over. This suggests the text is operating with a consistent internal logic. Joshua's mission was to eliminate the Nephilim, Rephaites, Anakites. It was fulfilled where it was possible, but the lineage survived where Israel had no control, and the survival generated generational conflict. Now let's look at archaeology. Bashan, Og's kingdom, has physical evidence that deserves attention. The region is known for megalithic structures called dolmens, large stone slabs forming chambers, thousands of them, some weighing dozens of tons. There's no consensus on who built them or when. Estimates vary from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, but the concentration in Bashan is notable, and the biblical text associates Bashan specifically with Og and the Rephaites. This does not prove the dolmens were built by giants, but it establishes that the region had a reputation for a lineage of exceptional stature and megalithic construction. Conventional archaeology attributes the dolmens to funerary practices of Neolithic societies. There is no problem with this reading, but it does not explain why the textual tradition connects Bashan, Og, Rephaites, and monumental structures so persistently. Another detail, Og's bed was preserved in Rabbah of the Ammonites. The text says it was still there when Deuteronomy was written. Why preserve this object? If it were just the furniture of a defeated king, it would have no memorial value. But if it were physical evidence of something exceptional, stature, lineage, technological capacity, then it would make sense to preserve it. The problem is that we don't have the structure today. We don't know if it was a bed, a sarcophagus, or another type of monument. But the fact that the text records its exact dimensions suggests there was something to be verified. It wasn't an allegory, it was a measurable object. The literal interpretation faces a problem. How does a population of exceptional stature sustain itself? Isolated individuals with gigantism exist, but an entire lineage requires a biological explanation. If they were humans with some genetic condition, like Marfan syndrome or pituitary gigantism, that would explain individuals, but not clans. Clans require stable reproduction, and extreme genetic conditions usually come with health problems that reduce longevity and fertility. So either there was something different in the biology of these lineages, or the text is using hyperbole. Hyperbole is a viable explanation. Ancient texts exaggerate enemies to glorify victories. But then why does the text of Numbers treat the stature of the Anakites as a sufficient reason to refuse entry into Canaan? Hyperbole does not generate real panic. Real threat generates real panic. The alternative reading, which connects the Nephilim of Genesis 6 to the Rephites, Anakites literally, faces another problem. Genesis 6 happens before the flood. The flood, according to the text, eliminated everything except Noah and his family. So how would the Nephilim reappear afterward? The text answers in Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. This, and also afterward, is a problematic line. It suggests continuity or recurrence. If there is continuity, then either the flood was not global or something survived. If there is recurrence, then the event that generated the Nephilim originally happened again. None of these options are simple, but the phrase is there. And the text of Numbers connects the Anakites to the Nephilim without hesitation. The conventional academic explanation is that Nephilim became a generic term for large or powerful peoples, much like Titans in Greek mythology. It doesn't mean literal descent, but a cultural category. This reading is reasonable and resolves the problem of the flood. But then, why does the text of Numbers use genealogical language? Descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. This is not the language of a category, it is the language of a lineage. And if it is a lineage, then the connection is more than metaphorical. This doesn't force a literal reading, but it makes the metaphorical reading harder to sustain without textual revision. Do you read Joshua's mission as strategic territorial cleansing, as the elimination of a specific genealogical lineage, or as a mixture of both? Why? Leave it in the comments. This helps to understand how different readings operate and where they diverge. The order of Harem, ritual extermination, appears in other contexts in the Old Testament. Jericho received Harem. Amalekites received Harem. But the language applied to the Rephites and Anakites has a nuance. It is explicitly connected to a pre-Israelite lineage that occupied the land before. Deuteronomy 2:10-11 says, "The Emmons were a people strong and numerous, and as tall as the Anakites." Like the Anakites, they too were considered Rephites, but the Moabites called them Emmons. The text is saying that different peoples use different names for the same lineage, and all these peoples, Moabites, Ammonites, Philistines, eliminated the Rephites from their territories. Israel was the last to do it, not the first. This creates a geographical and chronological pattern. The Rephites occupied regions before the arrival of historical peoples. They were eliminated or expelled. They survived in pockets, and these pockets, like Gath, continue to generate conflict. The strategic question is, why eliminate instead of subjugating? Subjugation generates revenue, workforce, taxes. Elimination generates military cost without immediate economic return. The only reason to choose elimination is if subjugation is considered too risky, and to be too risky, the threat must be perceived as existential. Not they are strong, but they are incompatible. The Book of Enoch, which is not canonical but circulated widely in Second Temple Judaism, offers an explanation. It expands on Genesis 6 and describes the Nephilim as hybrids fathered by watchers, celestial beings, and human women. These hybrids were violent giants who consumed resources, shed blood, and taught forbidden arts, and the flood was sent to eliminate them. But Enoch also mentions that the spirits of the Nephilim, called evil spirits, remained on the earth after the flood, causing oppression and conflict. This would explain the "and also afterward" of Genesis 6:4. It doesn't mean the Nephilim physically survived. It means the phenomenon recurred. This reading is theologically charged and rejected by most modern scholars as a late development, but it was taken seriously in ancient Judaism. And if Joshua and the authors of Numbers operated within this reading, then the mission to eliminate the Anakites was not just military, it was spiritual. It was to prevent the Nephilim corruption from spreading again. This would explain why the order was total extermination, not subjugation. It wasn't a matter of territory, it was a matter of genealogical or spiritual contamination. Modern reading rejects this as superstition, and it may be right, but then it needs to explain why the language of the text operates this way. Why connect the Anakites to the Nephilim? Why use harem? Why the insistence on eliminating even women and children, something that is morally problematic under any reading, but which makes strategic sense if the problem is hereditary? I'm not defending the ethics of the operation. I'm asking, what internal logic is the text following? And the answer seems to be the logic that these clans represented a generational threat that could not be neutralized by subjugation. Goliath appears in 1 Samuel 17 as the Philistine champion from Gath. His height is recorded as 6 cubits in a span, approximately 9 meters. He uses heavy armor, a bronze helmet, a coat of bronze scale armor weighing 5,000 shekels on about 57 kilos, bronze greaves, a spear with an iron point weighing 600 shekels, about 8 kilo. The description is technical, not poetic, and Goliath is not presented as an anomaly. He is presented as a representative of a lineage. When David kills him, the text does not say Israel eliminated a giant. It says David killed the Philistine. But 2 Samuel in the 21 and 1 Chronicles 20 list 4 brothers or relatives of Goliath, all giants, all from Gath, all killed by David's warriors. One of them, Ishbi-Benob, had a bronze spear weighing 300 shekels. Another had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. All are identified as descendants of Rapha, that is, Rephates. This confirms what Joshua 11. 22 had already said some Anakites remained in Gath, and they continued there for centuries, and they continued to be a specific threat. David did not fight giants in every Philistine city, only in Gath. Why? Because Gath was the stronghold that Joshua did not clear, and the lineage survived there. This means Joshua's mission had partial success. It eliminated the Rephates Anakites from Israelite territory, but it did not eliminate the lineage, and the lineage continued to generate conflict until David. The Archaeology of Gath, Tell-es-Safi, shows occupation from the Chalcolithic to the Persian period. Excavations found massive walls, monumental gates, and evidence of a large and organized population. There is no direct archaeological evidence of giants, but there is evidence that Gath was an important Philistine power center, and the biblical text connects Gath specifically to the Rephate lineage. This connection is textual, not archaeological, but it is persistent. It is not mentioned once and forgotten. It is reinforced in Joshua, Samuel, Chronicles. 3 different books, different contexts, but the same association, Gath and Rephates. The simplest explanation is that Gath had a population of above average stature, possibly due to local genetic or dietary factors. This does not require supernatural intervention. But then why does the text treat this population as a continuation of the Nephilim, Rephates, Anakites? Why the genealogical language? The answer may be that the text is operating within a cosmology where lineage matters more than modern biology, where descendant of Rapha is not just a description of stature, but a marker of cultural and perhaps spiritual identity. In this reading, eliminating the Rephates was not arbitrary ethnic genocide. It was a response to a threat perceived as ontological. This doesn't justify the ethics of the operation under modern standards, but it explains the internal logic of the text. And the logic is consistent. The Nephilim of Genesis 6 generated corruption. The Rephates Anakites were connected to them. Israel's mission was to eliminate them. The mission was fulfilled where possible, but survivals generated conflict until David. And even after David, the text does not claim complete elimination, only that the known champions were killed. The lineage may have continued on a smaller scale, or may have been absorbed, or may have gradually disappeared. The text does not close this loop. Another important element, the geographical connection between the Rephates and specific places. Bashan, Hebron, Debir, Gath. These are not just random cities. They are power centers. Bashan controlled the trade routes of the Transjordan. Hebron was a religious and strategic center in Judah. Gath controlled the Philistine coastal plain. These places were not chosen randomly for the narrative. They were truly power centers. And the text connects them to the Rephates. This suggests that the Rephates were not marginal nomads. They were local elites. They controlled territory, resources, trade, and Israel's mission was to displace these elites. If this reading is right, then Joshua's mission was not just religious, it was geopolitical. Eliminating the Rephates was eliminating the elites who controlled the power centers in Canaan. This would make Israel's conquest not just a territorial invasion, but a social revolution, displacing an ancient aristocracy and establishing a new order. In this reading, the language of giants and Nephilim would be propaganda, delegitimizing the local aristocracy by painting them as illegitimate or corrupted. They are not normal humans. They are descendants of Nephilim. Therefore, they can be eliminated without moral guilt. And this cynical reading is possible, but it faces a problem. Why would the propaganda be so specific? Why name individual clans? Why record the exact dimensions of Og's bed? Effective propaganda is generic and emotional. This text is specific and technical. This does not prove literality. But it makes a purely propagandistic reading harder to sustain. Something else was happening. It could be that the Rephates actually had above average stature. It could be that they controlled megalithic construction technology. It could be that they had a cultural reputation as an ancient and powerful lineage. Or it could be that the text is operating with multiple layers. Historical memory of real conflict. Theological interpretation, sucks. Genealogical reading connected to Genesis 6. What happens when you try to harmonize all these layers? You get a narrative where Israel enters Canaan, faces local elites of exceptional stature and power, connects these elites to the tradition of the Nephilim, receives a divine order to eliminate them, fulfills the order partially, and the survivals generate generational conflict until they are finally neutralized under David. This narrative is internally consistent. It does not require forced supernatural reading. But it also doesn't discard that the text believed in the Nephilim connection, and this belief generated real actions, Joshua's mission. Now the ethical question. Even if you accept the literal reading that the Rephates were descendants of Nephilim, that they represented an existential threat, the order of harem remains morally problematic. The extermination of women and children cannot be justified under modern ethics. So how does the text deal with this? Answer, it doesn't. It records the order and the execution without internal moral reflection. Moral reflection comes later, from readers who try to reconcile the text with their ethical intuitions. And there are three main responses. First, the text reflects the morality of its time, not timeless morality. Second, the order was specific to a unique context, eliminating the Nephilim lineage and cannot be generalized. Third, the text is using hyperbolic war language, and the elimination was not as literal as it seems. Each of these answers has problems. The first relativizes the text. The second still needs to justify why eliminating children would be acceptable, even in a unique context. The third faces the specific language of harem and the records of Joshua fulfilling the mission. There is no easy answer, but the question must be asked. If you accept that the Rephates were a real threat, genealogical, spiritual, or both, what would be the appropriate response? Subjugation, expulsion, elimination? Each option has implications, and the text chose elimination. This says something about how the text perceived the nature of the threat. It wasn't just military, it was existential. The last element to consider is what happened after David. The text no longer mentions giants after Goliath's brothers. Does this suggest the elimination was complete, or just that they ceased to be a significant threat? We don't know, but we know that historical Palestine has no later records of populations of exceptional stature. The Philistines were gradually absorbed or eliminated by other powers. Gath was destroyed by Hazael of Syria in the 8th century BC, if there were remaining Rephates. They disappeared from the historical narrative. It could have been genocide. It could have been assimilation. It could have been that the lineage simply became biologically extinct. The text does not close this loop. This leaves us with three final scenarios. Scenario A. The Rephates Anakites were truly descendants of the Nephilim of Genesis 6, represented a real existential threat, and were systematically eliminated over centuries by multiple peoples, culminating in Israel under Joshua and David. In this reading, the mission was necessary and successful, though morally complex. Scenario B. The Rephates were local elites of exceptional stature and power, were retrospectively connected to the Nephilim to justify their elimination, and Joshua's mission was a geopolitical revolution disguised as a divine mandate. In this reading, the mission was effective, but morally questionable. Scenario C. The Rephates were ordinary peoples. The language of giants is hyperbolic, the connection with Nephilim is theological, not genealogical, and Joshua's mission was standard military conquest with religious rhetoric. In this reading, the mission was normal for the time, but without special theological significance. Which scenario holds up better? It depends on how much weight you give to textual language versus historical context versus theological expectations. Scenario C is the most academically accepted because it requires fewer extraordinary assumptions, but it faces the specificity of the text. Why so many details about lineages, dimensions, territories? Scenario B is attractive to readers who want to maintain a historical basis without theological commitment, but it needs to explain why the propaganda would be so consistent and technical. Scenario A is the most literal and theologically charged reading, but it faces significant biological and ethical problems. What remains standing is this. Israel had a specific mission to eliminate certain clans. These clans were textually connected to the Nephilim. The mission was partially fulfilled. The survivals generated conflict until David, and after David, the threat disappeared. This is what the text says. Interpretation is another layer, but the internal narrative is clear. It was not a generic territorial conquest. It was the elimination of a specific lineage. And the reason, explicit or implicit, was that this lineage represented the continuity of something from Genesis 6 that could not be allowed. If this investigation was worth your time, if you came out with better questions than you went in with, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on the bell. We are building a community that doesn't accept ready-made answers, that doesn't ignore inconvenient text, and that doesn't sell fantasy when reality is more complex and more interesting. And if you have historical, archaeological, or textual resources that broaden or challenge what was presented here, leave them in the comments. This type of conversation is rare and valuable, and you might be sitting on something that changes the perspective. The last line of Joshua's mission is not triumphalist, it is practical. Joshua fulfilled what he could, the rest was left to David, and the rest of the rest disappeared from history. If the Rephates were what the text suggests, descendants of something prior to the flood, a lineage that survived or recurred, an existential threat that needed to be neutralized. Then the mission took centuries, but was concluded. If they were just local elites with good nutrition and a strong foundational narrative, then the mission was a successful revolution disguised as a holy war. Or if they were normal peoples with exaggerated rhetoric, then the mission was standard military conquest. But in all three cases, something real happened. Specific clans were eliminated, specific territories were taken, and the narrative of Israel began where the narrative of the Riphates ended. The next step is to investigate what David knew that Joshua didn't, because when David faces Goliath, he doesn't hesitate. He already knows exactly what he needs to do.